Unlike other fathers, here Augustine focuses in on Paul's claim that Peter was compelling the Gentiles to observe Jewish ceremonies and thus acting as if their observance was still necessary for salvation. And Augustine asserts that Peter was truly corrected and that Paul gave a true narrative of the event. However, I would like to push back on Augustine on 2 points. First, one of the customs handed down to Peter by his fathers was the separation of oneself from Gentiles and not eating with them. So Paul was condemning Peter for following that custom, yes? And so secondly, here's a key question. Is Augustine or Paul claiming that Peter compelled the Gentiles to observe Jewish laws merely by separating himself from the Gentiles, perhaps temporarily? Because that seems like a very weak claim to me. How could Peter be compelling the Gentiles in any way if he was avoiding them? Or is Paul somehow claiming that Peter did more than just separate himself from the Gentiles? Even if Paul is saying that the Gentiles would be tempted or feel compelled to observe the Jewish law, or would get the impression the law was necessary for salvation because of Peter's separation, that is still a far cry from Peter actually directly compelling the Gentiles to do anything. And seems like poor word choice, like an exaggeration or mischaracterization. Augustine will clarify in letter 82 what he thinks Paul meant by compel, as we'll see. Lastly, I want you to remember that Augustine says Peter did this through fear of those who were of the circumcision, because it seems like he will implicitly try to argue something different later in letter 82. Augustine tries to distinguish between Paul's concessions to the Jewish law versus Peter's. He says that, in contrast to Peter, apparently, Paul wasn't trying to give others the impression that he thought the observance of the Jewish law gave salvation. But Paul was merely trying to stop the Jews from thinking he condemned those rites or laws. Is Augustine really claiming that Peter was trying to give the impression that he thought the observance of the Jewish law gave salvation? Really? I don't think so, based on everything Augustine says, though it comes across that way here. But if so, that seems to go way too far. Again, unless Peter did and said something else that Paul doesn't mention, Peter merely acted out of fear of offending or losing Jewish Christians, as Augustine himself admits earlier in letter 40. Not that Peter acted out of some design to give the impression that he thought the observance of the Jewish law gave salvation. That seems to be reading too much into Peter's silence and separation. So, this whole attempt by Augustine to distinguish the two apostles along these lines in regard to their concessions to the law, it just doesn't work for me right now. How does Augustine know that Peter was not also trying to prevent others from thinking he condemned Jewish rites and customs? As I mentioned earlier, it's important to point out that we only hear Paul's side of the story or recounting of the Galatians 2 confrontation. We never hear Peter's side of the story or any context he might provide that might be relevant and significant to evaluating Peter's actions or inactions, and thus whether Paul's rebuke was fully justified and how he was perceiving Peter's actions. So, apart from questioning and scrutinizing Paul's own concessions to the old law, and apart from the theory that the whole confrontation was staged as a teaching moment, let's look at some other biblical facts or events that show, even before Paul, Peter had apparently already previously confirmed the liberty of Gentiles from the old covenant ritual laws like circumcision. The first major piece of evidence is that before the confrontation between Peter and Paul, we read in Acts 10 that Peter had already accepted and baptized the Roman God-fearer Cornelius and his household without requiring circumcision. After doing so, we read in Acts 11 that Peter immediately defended his actions toward Cornelius against the criticism of the circumcision party and silenced them. Another potential piece of evidence is the very Council of Jerusalem itself, at which Peter silenced the debate over circumcision and the burdens of the old law and denied their necessity. Of course, there is some debate on which came first, the Council of Jerusalem or the confrontation between Peter and Paul at Antioch. We'll see different opinions on the chronology a little later in the presentation, but I don't think it really matters overall. Irenaeus is perhaps the earliest witness to Peter's ambivalence with respect to the Mosaic Law. Irenaeus makes it sound like Peter's default was to follow the old law and only deviated from it when he perceived a clear divine intervention in the form of a vision or a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. Irenaeus points out that Peter was hesitant to even meet with Gentiles, even after being instructed by a vision and the Spirit to do so, and that Peter would not have done so unless commanded, as he had been. In this passage, Irenaeus is trying to prove that the God of the apostles was indeed the same God as of Moses. But it is interesting for our topic because it raises maybe the remote possibility that Peter might have, for a time, thought of Cornelius and his household as maybe a special exception, ratified by direct divine revelation. But, based on Peter's defense of his action in Acts 11 and the response of his critics, it seems like both Peter and his former critics came to realize or recognize a new dispensation for all Gentiles, not just Cornelius and his household. Bottom line for Irenaeus, Peter had already visited, conversed, taught, and eaten with Gentiles before Paul's rebuke. And Jesus made Peter a witness of every doctrine. Tertullian believes that both Peter and Paul made concessions to the observance of the law for a time, thinking there was a time when the matter was not even fully settled in the minds of the apostles, including Peter and Paul. Like Irenaeus, Origen also believes that Peter needed divine intervention, a vision, to get him to visit Cornelius and welcome Gentiles into the church. But even more interesting is how Origen points out something I said earlier, which is that it was a Jewish tradition for Jews to separate themselves from, quote, those who were beyond the pale of Judaism. And thus, there is actually some consistency in Peter observing this tradition if he was to primarily minister to the circumcision, to minister to the Jews, so as not to scare off new Jewish Christians or potential Jewish converts. If we are being charitable to Peter, I think Origen has hit on an insight that helps us understand Peter's decision and actions in a better or more sympathetic light, even if they were ultimately imprudent. Like Irenaeus, Chrysostom also points to the fact that Peter was already intimately acquainted with the controversy over how to welcome Gentiles into the church, more so than anyone else, citing Peter's defense of himself in Acts 11, as well as his vision. But Chrysostom goes further, citing the Jerusalem Council's decrees, saying Peter sent to those decrees. Clearly, Chrysostom believes that the confrontation between Peter and Paul came after the Jerusalem Council, where Peter had already taken a public authoritative stance, which would raise more questions than answers, I think. In light of Paul's own supposed prudent concessions to the old law, we might interpret Peter's own concessions and behavior in a similar light. That is what Jerome does, and what Jerome even ascribes to Paul, whether rightly or wrongly. Jerome says Peter pretended to keep the law in order to rescue the Jews, one step at a time, from their previous way of life, for they were not capable of instantaneously casting to the wayside their enormous effort in observing the law. And Jerome believes that Paul thought the same thing and was not trying to insult Peter, but recognized Peter's actions or inactions were only for the purpose of winning over Jewish believers entrusted to his apostolic care and establishing them in the faith and gospel of Christ. Notably, Jerome sees Peter's approach as something temporary until the Jews could be gradually led away from the old law. And I think this is a reasonable and charitable view to take in interpreting Peter's actions or inactions. In his letter to Augustine, like Chrysostom, Jerome defends Peter as knowing the law had been abrogated long before Paul, and as being the prime mover in the issuing of the decree that affirmed the abrogation of the law. Jerome quotes from Acts 10, 11, and 15 at length to defend Peter and the theory that no real rebuke happened. He says Peter was himself the author of that rule, with deviation from which he is charged. And that Peter was afraid to lose the Jewish Christians who had been committed to him. Because of this pastoral fear, Peter felt compelled to pretend to observe the law of Moses, even though he was thoroughly aware it had been abrogated. In contrast, Augustine thinks it more likely that Paul rebuked Peter before the Jerusalem Council, and of course that it was a real rebuke. But regardless of the chronology, Augustine doesn't think it strange for Paul to rebuke and exhort Peter, whether the incident took place before or after the Council of Jerusalem. If the council happened before the confrontation, then it shows Peter's actions were inconsistent or hypocritical or at best imprudent, but really did agree with Paul already. If the council happened after the confrontation, it shows that the confrontation had no impact on Peter's authority and shows the distinction between timid action or inaction and a formal exercise of his teaching authority. So, naturally, Augustine also affirms that Peter and Paul were both already of the same mind. We have a patristic consensus on this point. Regardless of when the Council of Jerusalem happened, Augustine believes that Paul already knew that Peter agreed with him, that they were of the same mind and same opinion with respect to circumcision and Jewish law, namely, that it was not necessary for salvation. So Paul was not teaching Peter anything. But Augustine believes that Paul rightly accuses Peter of timidly concealing the truth that they both knew and believed. Augustine doesn't emphasize one piece of evidence over another, but does list various pieces that show Peter was aware of the truth, and that Paul knew that Peter knew that. This would include the facts that Peter and Paul conferred with each other, as Paul tells us in Galatians 2:2. That Peter had been divinely instructed in the matter, referring to the vision in Acts 10. And lastly, and most obviously, because Paul apparently knew that Peter formerly saw no problem with eating with the Gentile converts in Antioch. So, similar to Jerome, Augustine sees Peter as pretending to observe the Jewish law. But more than that, and even worse, Augustine sees Peter as pretending to yield to the view that the Jewish law was necessary for salvation. But as I've already said, I do think that it's a little bit questionable for Paul or Augustine to assume that on the part of Peter. In addition to seeing no disproof of Peter's unique leadership and authority, Augustine says Peter is a great example of accepting correction from those who are our juniors, and that such humble acceptance of correction is more rare, requiring greater piety than what Paul had to do, and much more worthy of admiration and praise. On the flip side, Augustine believes Paul provides an example to those who are younger, that they should have courage even to withstand their seniors if the defense of evangelical truth required it, yet in such a way as to preserve unbroken brotherly love. Though I would still question whether Paul's calling Peter out publicly in front of everyone was necessary and a good example of how to preserve unbroken brotherly love. And on the topic of humbly accepting correction, I have found some evidence that some scholars believe Augustine may have changed Jerome's mind, getting Jerome to accept that Paul's rebuke was real and that Peter really deserved some blame. It appears that, after his correspondence with Augustine, in Jerome's Against the Pelagians, and perhaps other writings, he speaks of the rebuke and confrontation more in line with how Augustine saw it. Detractors of Peter and of the Catholic Church like to think that the confrontation between Peter and Paul proves that Peter did not have any greater authority than Paul. But we've already seen a lot of evidence that this is not the case. Moreover, there is even positive evidence to the contrary. In the very same chapter of Galatians, we see that Paul implicitly but clearly concedes that he was under the authority of Peter and the other apostles, who he also concedes were of repute, presumably by the entire church. Now, Paul does not think his gospel is wrong or incomplete or in vain, but he does allow for the possibility that that is the case, which is why he lays his gospel before them, before Peter and the other apostles. This is an implicit but clear concession to their authority. By saying that even Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, Paul concedes that the apostles had the authority to compel Titus to be circumcised in order to join or remain within the church. By saying they gave him their right hand of fellowship, Paul is admitting that they did in fact add something to him. The apostles added their own fellowship, reputation, and authority to Paul and to Paul's gospel. When interpreting the confrontation between Peter and Paul in Galatians 2, we have to take into account all the contextual evidence, including all these indicators that Paul submitted himself to the authority of Peter, James, and John. Irenaeus is the earliest father to comment further on why Paul went up to Jerusalem, namely, that the Judaizers summoned him to the apostles there, which speaks to some extent to the relative authority of Paul compared to the other apostles, even in the mind of Paul. Irenaeus is also the earliest father to comment on the chronology of events, saying that Paul's laying his gospel before those at Jerusalem in Galatians 2 coincides with the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. Like Tertullian after him, Irenaeus points out that heretics, like the Marcionites, used Scripture to claim that Paul was the superior apostle compared to the others, including Peter. I've heard some Protestants claim basically the same thing, appealing to the Galatians 2 incident and the fact that Paul's writings comprise a much larger portion of the New Testament than Peter's, as if that was somehow the measure of their relative authority, when that's clearly not a good measure at all. Jerome apparently concurs with Irenaeus on others obliging Paul to go to Jerusalem, and on the chronology lining up with the Acts 15 Jerusalem Council, though he is somewhat non-committal, saying that this is what others say. Jerome says that Paul and Barnabas allowed themselves to be sent to the apostles in Jerusalem so that there would be no doubt from that point on with respect to the law. And the fact that Paul met privately with the apostles first shows that Paul knew that he would receive resistance from a significant number of Jewish Christians there. Tertullian tells us that Paul went to Jerusalem to consult and confer with the apostles there because he desired the authority of the apostles, his predecessors, to confirm that his gospel was in accord with theirs. This is likely an interesting and early example of private revelation being subject to the authority of the church and its leaders. We know from Paul's own letter to the Galatians that he was taught the gospel through a revelation from Jesus Christ himself. However, at that point in time, it was merely a private revelation that was known only to Paul and binding upon him, but not known to others or binding upon others. Only after the apostles in council had ratified the gospel of Paul did the gospel of Paul become binding on the entire church and thus become public revelation. Tertullian goes on to repeat and reaffirm that Paul conferred with Peter and the rest of the apostles 14 years after he had first visited Peter. Tertullian then adds that Paul would indeed, of course, have been running and preaching in vain if Paul's gospel fell short of the gospel of the other apostles. Thus why Paul desired to be approved and supported by the apostles and their authority. Chrysostom tells us that although the apostles had allowed and tolerated the continuance of Jewish observances for a time, the apostles later ratified the opinion of Paul that circumcision was unnecessary. It was necessary for the apostles to do so because Paul's own apostleship and authority was not recognized by all in the church at that time, apparently. Chrysostom goes on to repeat and elaborate how the apostles found no discrepancy in Paul's preaching and thus did not condemn it, but rather confirmed it. Chrysostom sees this as Paul yielding to the apostles and rejects the notion that Paul taught the apostles or that the apostles taught Paul in this instance. Jerome, too, sees Paul as humbling himself before Peter and the apostles, and again to make sure that he neither was running nor had run his race in vain, and to show his humility. In his letter to Augustine, Jerome says Peter was of so great authority that Paul visited Peter once early on, and then Paul later laid his gospel before Peter, because Paul would not have had the confidence in his own preaching of the gospel if it had not been confirmed by the consent of Peter and those who were with him. What a pointed statement and argument about the greater authority of Peter, and how Paul acknowledged that. In addition to seeing no disproof of Peter's unique leadership and authority, Augustine affirms the primacy and dignity of Peter's office above every other episcopate. Augustine does not allow anyone to use the Galatians 2 confrontation as an excuse to elevate themselves above Peter. I think it's also worth mentioning that in comparing Cyprian and Peter here, Augustine also apparently sees a similarity in Cyprian being in error before a plenary or general council had corrected the error, just as Peter apparently could have been personally or privately in error before the Council of Jerusalem.